Hello and welcome to the IO Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. In this episode, we examine why great powers struggle to know one another's intentions and whether this uncertainty makes rivalry an enduring feature of international politics. I prepared a quotation from a book. My theory, which I label intentions pessimism, holds that great powers can rarely, if ever, be confident, which again means near certain that their peers have benign intentions, because it's extraordinarily difficult for them to obtain the requisite information. And this comes from the book Intentions in Great Power Politics, Uncertainty and the Roots of Conflict, written by Professor Sebastian Rosato, who is our guest today. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sebastian Rosato is Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame, where he is also a Fellow of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, the Lee Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, and the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. It's a very interesting book and idea that you wrote, because you have a series of books, which I will put into a YouTube description, about the power about states. You also wrote a book with John Mearsheimer, so that's also good to mention. But I like this book the most, I have to say, because it creates some puzzle in international relations theory. And puzzle is always welcome on this podcast. So let's speak about this. And my first question is, your central claim is that the great powers can rarely, if ever, be confident that their peers have benign intentions. But my question is this primarily a structural argument or epistemological one, or do you see those as inseparable in your framework?
I think I see them as inseparable, and let me explain. So my basic argument, as you know, is that knowing intentions is ultimately an information problem. Great powers can't reach confident conclusions. They're uncertain because they can't get enough information and they can't get enough good information about other states' intentions. Part of the problem is that state intentions are in leaders' heads, so they can't be directly observed. And to use your language, I think that's an epistemological issue. But the other part of the problem is that there are things out there that are related to intentions. For example, a state's behavior is related to its intentions. And I think here the issue is a structural one. Those things do not tell you a lot about intentions because of the structure of the international system. The international system is anarchic. There's no authority above states to enforce promises. So it's very difficult to infer intentions from actions in that kind of world. If a state signs a treaty, for example, you don't know if it actually intends to abide by that treaty because there's nothing stopping it from not abiding by the treaty. Compare that to domestic politics, which is structured hierarchically. There's a government, there's a central authority to enforce promises. That's a very different situation. I'm about to sell a house in London. The buyer has signed a contract to buy the house, and I can be fairly confident that they intend to buy that house because there are all sorts of repercussions for not doing so. So in a hierarchic system, you can infer intentions from actions, but in an anarchic system, you can't. And that's a structural problem. So the intentions issue is both epistemological and structural.
And when I go slightly deeper to what you said, I might phrase it as the acute uncertainty is endemic in international relations. But how did you come to that conclusion?
My only goal when I wrote the book was to figure out if states could, in principle and in practice, figure out each other's intentions. I had no goal beyond that. The reason I thought it was an important question was I think that the question of whether states can figure out intentions is a fundamental dividing line in international relations theory. But it's a fundamental dividing line, and what follows was not of interest to me. The question was, can they figure them out or can't they? And so I just started examining the intentions issue. I started with works of philosophy, stuff about other minds. I got into physics. I got into all sorts of different related literatures, and just decided on the basis of that in principle you can't figure out intentions. And then I took it to international politics and asked myself, is that true in international politics? Do states have trouble figuring out intentions for the reasons that I had theorized?
In the book, and you also mentioned that information is an important word. And you distinguish between first-hand information coming directly from the executive and the second-hand information drawn from surrounding sources. So there are two fundamental questions I would like to ask. The first one is, what are the limits of each? And is there any configuration of information access that could, even in principle, overcome the problem you identify? And the second question, by information, what do you mean? What can we imagine under this word when we are researching international relations?
Let me start with the whole question of first and second-hand information. So I have slightly different arguments about the two kinds of information. My argument is that first-hand information, and that's, as you said, that's the actual ideas states have about what they intend to do. My argument about that is that it is inaccessible. You just can't access it because it's in leaders' minds. To make matters worse, it's in only a few leaders' minds. Only a few leaders know what the intentions of their state are. So there aren't many places to look when you're trying to figure out intentions. And even worse, states have all sorts of reasons to hide their intentions so that they can gain a strategic advantage. The most famous example here, obviously, is Adolf Hitler. But I would just say to you that concealment of intentions is everywhere in international politics, in my experience. So I think there's basically no chance of gathering first-hand information about intentions. Then the second-hand information. Now, the beauty of second-hand information is that it is accessible. You can see what states do. You can see what they say. You can even be confident, I think, about what they want. I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that states want to be secure, right? That seems like a basic. And these statements and these actions, these desires are clearly all connected to intentions. But the problem here is not an accessibility problem. The problem here is a reliability problem. It's not at all clear how these pieces of information are connected to intentions. Just to go back to something I just said, take the fact that we all know that states want to be secure. We can be pretty sure about that. The question is, what does that mean about their intentions? And it could mean that they intend to act defensively. Take France and Russia before World War I. I think that was their intention. In order to be secure, they were going to go on the defensive. But it could also mean that they want to act aggressively. I think Germany also wanted to be secure before World War I, but it intended to become secure by destroying its neighbors. So you have same basic goal, which is security, two different intentions. Okay, I keep mentioning, as you said, information. I think of information as just clues about what intentions might be. I think maybe clues is a better word. There are things states do, there are things they say, there are things they want, again, security being the important one, that give you some insight into what their intentions are. That's how I think about the issue.
You might have people coming with information as this or that, So for some people, information might be a speech, a policy paper, the official policy of the government. and for some it's a bilateral agreement. So therefore, I think it's a good to clarify what is what when we speak about
Oh,
theory.
and again, you're right. And not only speeches and statements and policy papers, but actions, mobilizing of troops, purchasing of different weapon systems, the joining international institutions. I mean, there are all sorts of things. Anytime a state performs an action, there is an intention there. And so that's what I mean about information about intentions. There are a lot of things that are connected to intentions in important ways.
Yeah, I, for instance, come across your book, not because I was intentionally seeking for it, but I was looking for something how to explain intentions in Russian-Chinese energy relations, where you have the information problem because you can't access everything, you are very limited. Then you have the second-hand information based on your wording, which is quite vast. But how much is reliable and accurate? Because you know how the statistics are cooked and the words are interpreted. So that was just, I would say, coincidence, but a very useful one. So this book opened some avenues for my research, and I think it's quite useful, even though you are doing sort of like going through the history. So it's a big canon of information and sources. My research is quite limited to bilateral, but still, I think I can use many ideas from the book in a very good way. So I think this is also interesting implication of the book written and the practical research application.
Bob Jervis, who's a very famous IR theorist, once said that no action or statement is self-evident. And I think that's what I think about reliability. Um, it can always have more than one meaning.
Absolutely. Especially when you have like three languages, Russian, Chinese, and English. So also the translation is not 100%. Anyway, you argue that states compete not simply because the international system is anarchic, but because they cannot reliably know whether other states have benign intentions. How does this differ from Waltzian neorealism? And are you correcting, extending, or replacing structural realism?
So, as you know from the question you just asked, one of the big critiques of Kenneth Waltz is that he has only two assumptions about international politics. Waltz assumes that the international system is anarchic and that states want to survive. And as many people have pointed out, you cannot get competition from those two assumptions. And all sorts of different people have done this. Defensive realists like Charlie Glazer say Waltz's theory cannot produce competition without something he calls the security dilemma. And at the heart of the security dilemma is the problem of uncertainty of intentions. John Mearsheimer, who's an offensive realist, very different realist from Charlie Glazer, he makes the same point. He memorably said that without uncertainty about intentions, Waltz's train cannot get out of the station, right? You can't get to competition. So you have to add uncertainty to the mix. And yes, in that sense, my book is a corrective to the fundamental basis of structural realism. I add an assumption that I believe has to be there to make it work, and other people believe has to make it work. And I explore that assumption in the book. But I will say that it's not just a correction. Once you make that correction, you also get a genuinely different set of arguments, still structural realist, but a different set of structural realist arguments about how the world works, about what competition looks like, about why wars happen, about how alliances function. But that's the subject of another book, and that's not the book that we're discussing here. But I just wanted to stress, and this is obviously You have to take this with a pinch of salt because I'm complimenting myself. I don't believe it's just a correction. I believe that it has important implications.
And after you wrote the book, and there is always a time to settle with all the ideas, has it changed or slightly adjusted your approach or stance to international relations theory? Like you might say, before I was firmly at this stance, but after I wrote the book, this has changed. Was there any element or component of your higher thinking that has changed?
Yeah, I think introducing uncertainty, and again, I did it because I thought that realism couldn't work without it. Uncertainty about intentions was the first step. And then I wrote a book, as you mentioned early on, with John Mearsheimer, and we were talking about rationality. And we discovered in the course of that book that it's not just uncertainty about intentions that causes great powers to compete. And so suddenly intentions was not just uncertainty about intentions, but it was about all sorts of other things, goals. And then the more I thought about it, another thing that great powers are deeply uncertain about is the offensive capabilities of other states. So they don't only not know if other states want to hurt them, that's intentions. They also don't really know if they can. And there are all sorts of information problems there. So then that led me to think that, what unites all of these things is uncertainty. And then I was like, okay, well, is it states that are uncertain about these things, or is it the international system that creates uncertainty about all of these things? And the point I've reached now is that it's the international system that is uncertain. International politics is, to use my new language, an information deficient enterprise. And that has all sorts of consequences for how states think about their adversaries, their friends, and what they should do. So it was originally a discrete question addressing a particular theoretical issue. But I think now when I talk about international politics as a structural realist, I always begin with states operate in an anarchic, that's Waltz, and uncertain international system. So my understanding of the system has changed.
Very interesting, and I think you put it very nicely here to explain it for people who have perhaps less knowledge about higher theory. So that's quite useful. I would like to ask you one question about the title, because you say great power politics, but can we apply this to, let's say, small states or middle powers, or is this concept basically about the great powers only?
I think you could certainly take some elements of the argument and apply them to minor powers. But the issue is, or to make the argument work, you need states to truly be in anarchy, and only the great powers are truly in anarchy. Other minor powers work within a system controlled by the great powers, and um, so they're not operating in an anarchic system. And I also think that there are a number of situations for minor powers where you can know their intentions mainly because they have no capability. The United States can know Canada's intentions, not because it knows how Canada it thinks about the United States, but it knows that Canada has no plans, right? Does not intend to act aggressively towards the United States because it simply can't. So in cases like that, intentions kind of aren't really a major issue. You have to be talking about states that can hurt each other, and then the question of intentions comes in, and so that applies to great powers. It's not so clear it applies to minor powers. I'll say one last thing here, though. I do think that uncertainty does often prevail amongst minor powers. You just have to think about the end of the Cold War and the European powers. It was pretty clear when the Cold War ended that Britain and France were actually quite concerned about German intentions. It was they were very keen to keep the United States in Europe as a pacifier. And that tells me that even amongst minor powers, the whole question of uncertainty about intentions is a big issue.
Some say that your argument risks becoming a truism. And let's put it in this way. How do you distinguish intentions pessimism from skepticism? And what would it take to falsify your theory?
If by skepticism you mean being doubtful about claims that don't have strong evidentiary proof, that's how I think about skepticism, then there's no difference between intentions pessimism and skepticism. I mean, my whole point is you don't believe things for which you don't have good evidentiary proof. Is it a truism? I think it verges on a truism. You clearly think it might be a truism, but I think the vast majority of international relations scholars, and I do mean the vast majority, don't think so. They believe that you can gather the kind of information that you need to reach confident conclusions about intentions, and they also believe that states have done that in the past. So for them, it is not a truism in any way, either in principle or in practice. Falsifiability, you just have to show me a case where two great powers believed the other had benign intentions. Like, to use a different language, you just have to show me two cases or a case where great powers trusted each other. And if you can show me that, I'm prepared to accept that I'm wrong.
And do you have any major higher theory from which the criticism or arguments come to face your theory or your arguments?
I think when I was writing the book, the theory that I found, or the set of theories that I found most difficult to deal with, is a body of theory called offense-defense theory. And basically, offense-defense theory argues that you can categorize weapons as being offensive or defensive, and states can privilege one kind of weapon over the other. And by privileging one kind of weapon over the other, they signal their intentions, right? If they buy defensive weapons, that signals benign intentions. If they buy offensive weapons, it signals malign intentions. And I deal with it in the book. I believe that the signal sent by those weapons acquisitions is not strong enough. I think that in order to send a strong signal, states would have to send a strong signal of benign intent. They would essentially have to disarm. That's possible, but states aren't going to do it, right? So it is possible, but there's just no way a state would disarm in the face of a peer competitor. So there are possible signals, but they're not used. So that was the toughest one I came up against, and I'll tell you, I think it's because they've paid the most attention to the whole issue of intentions. Offense-defense theory is all wrapped up in the whole debate about the security dilemma, which I mentioned earlier. And the security dilemma is all about uncertainty, about intentions and capabilities. So that was the toughest argument to deal with, and the one that I kept coming back to.
There are two camps, liberal institutionalist and constructivist. Liberal institutionalists argue that transparency institutions, and we all know that theory, can reduce uncertainty about state intentions, while constructivists go even further, arguing that trust can be developed through sustained social interactions. And I would like to ask you, what would be your comment on this?
So, by the way, these were obviously the two other major theories that I considered, in addition to offense-defense theory. Um, Liberal institutionalists and constructivists can actually nicely be taken together, which is probably why you asked the question, because they basically argue that you can get reliable secondhand information. When you really get down to it, what both theories say is that you can observe states' actions or interactions, right? And that provides you reliable information about their intentions. Um, my dissent from those arguments is that uh, states can't get reliable information about intentions from actions. Any given action can suggest a state is benign, and it can also suggest that a state is malign. And I'd like to give you a nice example from the 1920s that I dug up. Germany in the 1920s was behaving in a very accommodating fashion with France. To use the language of liberal institutionalism and constructivism, they were acting and interacting with France in ways that would said something about their intentions. So President Raymond Poincaré asked his chief advisor Philippe Berthollet at the Foreign Ministry. He said, "Does all of this action and interaction mean that Germany is truly serious about rapprochement? Right? Are their actions a clear signal that they want to accommodate us?" And Berthollet said, "I think Germany is probably sincere." And then he said, "And I also think Germany is probably insincere." Um, and then he says, "Just like any other state." And what he meant was that German actions might actually signify a desire for peace, right? But they could also reflect a desire to buy more time so that they could come up after France later on. And he was very honest, and he said, "I can't tell." Again, as I said earlier, survival, same desire, different intentions. Here, you've got accommodation. It's an action. Same action, different interpretations. And it's just very hard to tell, which of those you should believe.
And I think this nicely bridges to the next question, and that's about the regime. And for instance, democratic peace theories argue that shared institutions and democratic norms allow democracies to signal that they have benign intentions. It's also questionable, but it's a solid argument, I think. But the question is more general. Your theory, how does it work with different regimes?
I don't think regime type matters at all in my story. I think um, all states have intentions. All states have intentions in decision makers' heads, in a few decision makers' heads, who have great incentives to hide them. And all states behave in the world. All states make statements in the world, and all of those are unreliable. So regime type doesn't matter. Now, you mentioned democratic peace theory. Um, so the argument there is that, well, there are two arguments. One is that democracies tend to have benign intentions because of their domestic institutions that represent um, domestic groups that don't want to fight. That's one part of the argument. The second part of the argument is that democracies are especially good at signaling their intentions. And the reason here is that the institutions punish leaders who lie about what their intentions are. So you can believe their statements. So not only are they benign, but when they say they're benign, you can believe them. And that's the argument that regime type matters. Um, but the fact of the matter is that it doesn't. I have a case in the book, which is the Anglo-American rapprochement, which is a famous supposed example of these two mechanisms at work, right? That the United States and Britain both wanted peace and were able to communicate that to each other. They believed each other, and therefore they reached an accommodation. The fact of the matter is, if you look at the empirical record, that's not what happened. There's just a ton of evidence that Britain and the United States mistrusted each other. The rapprochement goes from about 1895 to 1905, maybe 1907. There's hardly any evidence. I'm tempted to say no evidence, but there's hardly any evidence in those 12 years that they trusted each other, and that they trusted each other for the reasons, because they were democracies. In fact, this is why the United States was so intent on pushing the British out of the Western Hemisphere, right? I mean, people forget that the rapprochement coincides with the United States eliminating British influence in the Western Hemisphere. That doesn't sound like trust to me. And a lot of people say, well, Britain left because it trusted that the United States would look after the Western Hemisphere for it. No, Britain left because it was outgunned, hopelessly outgunned, and it had much more or much greater concerns at home, where Germany's engaging in a naval race, right? And the European continent is in a situation where the balance of power might be breaking down, and they may have to fight a war.
There is one question that might be considered as the ugly one, but as academics we can go through. And that's the selection of cases in your book. Some people might argue that you selected those cases to fit your theory. How would you respond to that people and that argument?
I think the first thing I'll say is that the cases in the book are actually every single case that I can think of over the last 250 years that's commonly cited as an example of trust. There are no others. So my case selection criteria was to take the entire set of cases. But let's set that aside. Question is, why did I choose cases of supposed trust? I did that to make the test of my theory as hard as possible. My idea was that I shouldn't be able to find much evidence of mistrust in any of the mistrust in any of the cases. These are canonical cases of trust. I should not be able to find mistrust. And of course, it also occurred to me that if I actually found a lot of mistrust, then my argument would be even more powerful, because I had found mistrust where, in the very few cases where scholars had said they found trust. But then, of course, you got to interpret the evidence, and I could be accused of cherry picking the evidence, of like just looking for examples of mistrust in cases that were actually full of trust. But I didn't find that, and I actually don't think I cannot imagine that you could read the cases differently from the way I read them. I think there were maybe a couple, there were obviously a couple of times where somebody says something where you think, well, maybe that's an example of trust. And those were issues that I focused on like a laser. One example is, there is some evidence that Ronald Reagan at different points in time trusted Mikhail Gorbachev. But then when you look at it, he then would act in ways that suggested he didn't trust him. So even those, and again, there are very, very few examples, but even in those very few examples, it would be very hard. It would take a very special reading of the situation to say that he trusted Gorbachev. So I think the empirical record, as that, is obvious. And I think you talked about being social scientists. I don't think that's the same as saying that my theory is quote unquote unfalsifiable, right? I do think the theory can be falsified in principle. As I said earlier, just show me evidence that states trusted each other, and then I'm wrong. Um, so it's falsifiable. But the fact is, it's not falsified in these five cases. And these are the five cases where it should be falsified. Um, what does that mean? I think it actually means that I have a pretty good theory. I chose tough cases and I could explain them.
I think it's been 5 years since the publication of the book, I think, 2021, I think. Yeah. So, in the last 5 years, is there any case that if you were writing this book now, you would include? Is there anything that you see that, oh, that would be perfect case for the theory coming from the contemporary geopolitics and international relations?
No. I mean, I haven't thought about it that hard. I tend to write a book and move on. Before this interview, over the weekend, I reread my book because I haven't read it since 2021, and I thought maybe I should be prepared. But so I haven't thought much about it, but nothing springs to mind. More importantly, I would point out uh, there have been some reactions to the book. Um, there was an exchange in a journal called International Security, which is a very prominent journal in the field. And obviously, I've received lots of correspondence, but no one has raised a possible extra case. The five cases that I have, which are Bismarck, the rapprochement, the Anglo-American rapprochement, the French, German, and Japanese US cases in the 20s, and the end of the Cold War. Um, no one has added to those five cases.
I think that's also very interesting because you see and we see that debate is ongoing, which is I think very good for the theory and the book. I would like to touch one issue, and that's the tension between material and ideational explanations. And when we are reading of the Soviet withdrawal from the Eastern Europe, that attributes that shift to material pressure rather than trust in the United States. So, in some way, how do you see this? I mean, maybe tension is overstated here, yeah? But sort of like configuration of the material and ideational explanations.
So I have a very simple, and I hope it's not simplistic, way of dealing with this. Um, the Soviet Union's decision to stop competing with the United States at the end of the Cold War, and part of that involved withdrawing troops from Eastern Europe, was, I think, a stunning behavioral change. Right? They went from competing to, I don't know what you want to call it, conciliating, conceding, whatever it might be. So the question you have to ask yourself is, do changes like that happen because there's a major change in the military balance? And you need a major change because it's a major change in behavior. So is there a major change in the military balance? And that's the material pressures you're talking about. Or is there a major change in the understanding of intentions? Did the Soviets go from uncertainty about the United States to confidence that the US was benign? And on this point, I don't think the evidence is ambiguous at all. The Soviet Union collapsed militarily. It was a major material change. Um, but its views of US intentions didn't change. So material factors have to explain the case. You have to have something that changes to explain something that changes. You can't have something that stays constant explaining a change. By the way, the same is true of the Anglo-American rapprochement that we were talking about earlier. Britain withdrew from the Western Hemisphere. That's a major behavioral change. And so then the question is why? And if you look at it, it's clear that its military situation became untenable at the turn of the century. It's also clear that its assessment of US intentions didn't change. So again, it has to be material rather than ideational factors that account for the change in behavior.
When we read the book, we see the cases and we are thinking, is intentions pessimism a theory about states or about leaders? And does that distinction matter for your argument or not at all?
I'm actually surprised to hear you say that you read the book as distinguishing between states and leaders. And it must be something about the way I wrote it that
Or
gave you that impression.
maybe it's the way I understood it in some way. Maybe I have to reread the book. I don't know. I mean, it just was sort of feeling sometimes when I was reading the book, and it's just my honest opinion. I'm not looking for any like very strong arguments or something. But sometimes I was thinking, is this about the state behavior, like uncertainty, or leaders as a hidden that we can't read?
Um, I think, and I do say this, I know they say this early on in the book, that when it comes to the actor that has intentions or the actor that is reading intentions, the quote unquote state is the same as the state's executive. They're one and the same thing. And I do think that's front and center in the book. And I'll just make two quick points here, because this has come up before. The first is I don't think you can theorize great power politics in any other way. I think it's very difficult to theorize great power politics somehow distinguishing states from their leaders, especially because states are not things. States don't make decisions; leaders make decisions. Um, Second thing I'd say is I think it's actually an increasingly common conceptual move among international relations theorists. Again, to reference my more recent book on rationality, we equate the state with the executive in that book. And I, I think just to go a step further, if you're going to have a theory that is testable, you have to equate states with leaders because the only evidence you're going to find is about how leaders think. There's no way you can figure out how a state thinks. It's an inanimate object.
The past decade has seen dramatic advances in signals intelligence, satellite surveillance, and AI assisted analysis. Does that move introduce a unit level variables that sit in tension with your general theory, or do you see it as a consistent?
Um, I think signals intelligence, AI, the short answer is uh, they don't change the problem that I have identified. And let me say a little bit more about that. Look, there is no doubt that these developments will give states more information about each other, and specifically, they'll give more information about each other's capabilities, and they'll give each other information about each other's actions. And again, obviously, capabilities and actions are related to intentions. You have to have certain capabilities to pursue certain intentions. Certain actions suggest certain future actions. So there's a connection there. But I think the fundamental problem remains, to go back to what I said right at the beginning, which is that that relationship is unreliable. Um, you could have truly excellent information about a state's arms acquisitions. So you could know its military capabilities, but that tells you hardly anything about whether it's arming for offensive or defensive purposes. Um, and just to give you an example from way before the AI age, um, if you look at the lead up to World War One, the British had excellent information about German capabilities. Um, they might as well have lived in an AI surveillance world. They knew everything there was to know about German military capabilities. Um, and But Edward Grey who's the British Foreign Secretary, meets with the Germans more than once, and he says, "I'm well aware of your capabilities. I've followed your foreign policy very, very closely for decades, and I can't tell if you are arming for offense or acting to prepare for offense, or whether you're arming for defense and acting to prepare for defense, right? So here's a situation where he had all the information he needed, all the information available, which again is a situation that people claim we're moving towards with AI and surveillance. Um, but so the information is plentiful, but the interpretation, um, that's not helped by any of these new developments.
I would like to ask you about the role of diplomacy and statecraft when we consider your theory. Because intentions pessimism, it creates sort of a clear avenue how to think. And then you might think, is there anything that can improve how we know about intentions? Or is there any bridge between what we know and what we don't know? So, how do you see diplomacy or statecraft?
As I've said a couple of times, I think that uncertainty is part of the structure of the international system. And don't forget, anarchy is the other pillar. So it's anarchy and uncertainty. And I think that condemns states to compete. Um, I think of them as trapped in an iron cage, where they have competition as their only option. And in that world, statecraft and diplomacy don't matter very much. Um, I have a very fatalistic view of international politics. Um, you know, for all the efforts that states make, um, they're trapped in this situation. Um, I just want to be very clear. I'm fatalistic, but I don't like it. I wish the international system were otherwise and there were a way out. But I just don't see, as long as the system remains anarchic and as long as the world remains uncertain, and I think both of those two things are irresolvable, I don't see how a different world is possible.
So maybe that also might be a piece of advice for foreign policy analysts who are producing reports, papers to implement the uncertainty in maybe much greater scale.
Um, I actually think foreign policy analysts basically agree with me. When I looked at the historical record and when I talk to foreign policy analysts today, I'm just struck by um, how how carefully they think about the issue, how they gather all the information they can, and then how extremely cautious they are about inferring intentions. Um, there's a great case from the late 1970s. There's a memo that Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote to President Jimmy Carter, and it was about Soviet intentions. And it was the result of a major study in the United States. A lot of analysts got together to produce this document. And I can't remember the exact details, but Brzezinski said, look, we've looked at 14 sources of information. What is their nuclear policy? What is their policy in Africa, et cetera, et cetera. We've looked at all this information. And in three of the cases, we think that it suggests that the Soviet Union is neutral. In five of the cases, it might be, not it is, right? It might be, uh, it may have malign intentions. And in six cases, it looks like it might, again, might have benign intentions. And so what was his conclusion? His conclusion was, I don't know. Right. I am acutely uncertain about intentions. And I think that's how policymakers think. Um, even so Winston Churchill famously wrote a history of the Second World War after the Second World War. And he says in that history, says, I figured out Nazi Germany's intentions early on, right? I was one of the first guys. If you go and look at what he wrote in 1933, 1934, 1935, he is not uh, he is not convinced that Germany has malign intentions. He actually wrote an article that was published where he says, I don't know, Adolf Hitler could be a great force for good and peace in the world. Um, so, he was saying I had figured out intentions, but he hadn't really figured out intentions. Um, and I came across just one example. I don't know if this is interesting, but I've found one policymaker or someone connected to policy who believed that they had figured out intentions, and it's George Kennan. George Kennan argues, I think I can't remember if it was in, I think it was referenced in his biography for sure. But anyway, he said, I figured out Soviet intentions. Um, but then he says, but what really frustrated me was whenever I went to the State Department and talked to my friends, they refused to take my conclusions on board, right? They remained uncertain. So I think policy analysts uh, have very little to learn from me. I think policy analysts know exactly what I'm saying.
And on the other side, the people who are receiving the policy papers?
Um, Again, I think that people process information in in what I call very rational, legal ways. People look at information and they realize almost axiomatically that it has multiple meanings, and it has to be treated carefully. And if they do reach a conclusion, they reach a tentative conclusion. Um, but in great power politics, tentative conclusions aren't enough, right? It's not enough for me to, it's not enough for the United States today to reach the conclusion that China is likely benign, because if it turns out not to be benign, the consequences could be catastrophic. So, so I do think that you can slightly move the needle with information on what you think about intentions. But the question is, can you be confident, right? And again, in great power politics, you have to be confident. And I think confidence is impossible.
The last question for today's great interview. Uh, each theory has a start, it settles, and then sometimes it's sort of processed through different books, maybe papers. So I would like to ask you about the theory itself. How do you see its current development and a future? Like what do you see as a direction or avenue of research? And maybe is there anything that junior scholars, especially early career scholars, can contribute to it in some research? Maybe there is some area which is under research that you would like to mention, and they can work with your theory.
I think what they work on is up to them. I think uh, I never wrote with the intention of setting a research agenda. My approach, let's say over the last 10 years, has been that I want to produce a theory of great power politics. If you're going to if you're going to come up with a theory of great power politics, you have to have a really strong understanding of the fundamental building blocks of that theory. And the building blocks are, again, anarchy, uncertainty, which is obviously where I focus a lot of my work, rationality, are states rational actors? Because in order for a structural theory to push states to do things, they have to respond to it in more or less rational ways. And so each project for me, and then obviously security, I say that, states seek security, and I've written about the whole issue of security. But so each project is discrete. I've wanted to get inside each of the building blocks and figure them out for myself. And now the idea is to take all the building blocks and take what I've learned. And as I said to you, I've learned a lot more about uncertainty in the 5 years since the book came out, and I've extended my understanding of it. And take all of those things and put them together and develop a theory of great power politics. So the other thing I'll say is, and maybe this is somewhat unusual. Oh, I think it is somewhat unusual for scholars. I never do follow-on projects. So my first book was about the European Union. It was about the construction of the European Union. It was ultimately a balance of power theory of cooperation. I've never commented on the European Union since that day. This is the first time I've ever spoken to anybody about intentions in a public forum since the book came out. So I just don't do follow-on projects. And by the way, I don't think it's a good idea for junior scholars to do follow-on projects. I think junior scholars should ask themselves big and important questions. And if they're asking themselves a big and important question and they happen to come across me in their work, then they need to hopefully take me seriously and deal with me, but then they need to move past me, right? I don't think scholarship works by creating people who do incremental work. And I know this is a controversial claim because we believe in normal science, but I don't think we make advances in our understanding by doing incremental improvements or extensions of somebody else's work. I think we ask ourselves big questions and make bold claims and then see how far we can push them.
Professor Rosato, many thanks for sharing your insights and your thoughts about very interesting book and theory. And I think in many ways it can influence the perceptions and perspectives of many people who think about international relations, especially great powers. Many thanks for being on the IO Thinker.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.